Now, some Senate Democrats are in favor of stricter means testing when it comes to determining which Americans are eligible for the direct $1,400 checks that are proposed by Joe Biden in his version of the $1.9 trillion relief package. Now, one of those Senate Democrats happens to be Tim Kaine, who does in fact take some pretty conservative positions on issues, and is funded primarily by the types of companies and people who push for austerity and are definitely in favor of this kind of means testing. Now, in the previous bill, the means testing would basically indicate that anyone making over $75,000 a year would start to see the amount of money that they receive from the direct checks taper off. And by the time you get to $99,000 a year, you no longer qualify for those direct checks. Now, there is an orchestrated effort by the right wing and by corporate Democrats to pursue further means testing, which would indicate that the cap would, where the amount starts to taper off in terms of the direct relief checks, would be $50,000 a year as opposed to $75,000 a year. And as I've mentioned before, this means testing is determined based on tax filings in 2019 when the pandemic had not even hit yet, meaning that people were still employed and the tens of millions of Americans who were laid off hadn't been laid off yet because the pandemic hadn't impacted their jobs yet. Now, with that context, I just want to note that I wholeheartedly agree with Chris Hayes in the exchange that you're about to hear while he's interviewing Senator Tim Kaine. Let's watch.
Here's my pitch to you, Senator. then I'll shut up. Don't do this, A. B, if you have to do it, and you need 50 votes, so whatever. Just give people checks and tax it back next year if they had a good year and didn't need it. This idea that you're gonna means test off 2019 income, which is currently, it's not capturing the need. Please don't do this. Okay, you respond. I'll shut up now.
Chris, so here's what I. So I absolutely agree with the White House. We shouldn't shrink the check amount. If we target the check a little bit more in terms of the means, but we take the money we save and we put it into more vaccines or more unemployment insurance or more housing aid or more SNAP benefits, we can meet the needs.
Again, the logic here of means testing gets complicated and people their income in 2019 isn't relevant. All I would say is the tax code next year is a great means and it will score the same. By the way, for CBO purposes, it'll score the same if you just tax it back next year.
Could be a budget committee staffer, Chris, with that comment.
Okay.
So I certainly do not in any way respect the framing that I've heard from Senator Tim Kaine on this issue. He's essentially giving people an ultimatum, meaning that if we use the same means testing that was originally used, which by the way, I'm against that means testing as well then maybe we're not gonna have money for vaccine distribution. And no, how about we want the whole enchilada and more, and don't buy into that framing of, no, well, we got a nickel and dime, we're gonna have to cut off the relief checks unless we're willing to cut spending on vaccine distribution during this pandemic. I'm sorry, I'm not buying that. Cenk, I'm curious what you think.
Well, they really leave us no choice but to question intent and or intelligence, right? And so I know they hate it when I say that, and I don't want to say it. It's not a nice thing to say, but if you really wanted 1,400, right? Put aside the fact that they said 2,000, and there was some confusion about whether they meant 2,000 more or 2,000 in total. Put that aside for now. And then you really wanted the 1,400 to finish the 2,000. Well, you would start with 2,000 as your negotiating position because the Republicans are going to come in much lower. So now, if you had done that, then and you wanted the appearance of it being bipartisan, you wouldn't have to compromise on the threshold income. You could quote unquote compromise on bringing it from 2,000 to 1,400. And then it would seem like a giant compromise that you did, but still got to 2,000 in total. So then you got unity and bipartisanship and you passed the maximum amount. So, I mean, I would literally ask the Senate Democrats, but they would never come on to talk about it because we're not gonna be as as forgiving, honestly, because we're going to challenge them. And Chris did a great job there. Don't get me wrong. And those are the right questions, et cetera, right? But there is no answer to that. They either have to say, well, we just don't know how to negotiate and we blew it, right? Or we didn't really want there to be a cutoff of $75,000 in income. We didn't want to give that much. We wanted to give less. And so this was a good way of giving less. That way we just say the Republicans made us do it, when in reality it was our donors who made us do it, because we don't need a single Republican vote. That's the brutal truth. And that's why the Young Turks is hated by the establishment, because we tell you things that are really simple and obvious and true.
So, and we like to provide receipts, right? Because it's important to provide the data and evidence for why we have the analysis that we do. So first, incredibly important point is that the data that the means testing would be reliant on is not accurate, meaning that it does not actually apply to this crisis and the situation that people are experiencing, because the data is from 2019, when people hadn't lost jobs as a result of the pandemic yet. And so I apologize if you watch the show regularly and I sound repetitive, but for anyone who's new, it's important for you to know this. So the Daily Poster, based on US Census data, did a great job in pointing out that 45% of households earning between $50,000 and $150,000 have experienced a loss of employment income since March of 2020, including 48% of households earning between $50,000 and $75,000. Clearly, the tax filings from 2019 do not properly reveal the extent of the pain that Americans are suffering right now as a result of that pandemic. It's also important to know what motivates these lawmakers in pursuing austerity and certain strict, means testing measures when it comes to government aid. And the US Chamber of Commerce has a lot to do with this. So the Daily Poster also reported about the money in politics involved in what's going on right now. The US Chamber of Commerce, which spent $82 million lobbying in Washington last year, sent a letter to the White House and Congress urging them to consider, quote, targeting any additional stimulus checks based on income, loss of employment, or similar criteria. And an excerpt from their letter stated this: while the pandemic-induced recession has created near unprecedented levels of hardship, the impact has not been universal, the chamber wrote. The Census Bureau Pulse survey indicates that while a majority of households with less than $50,000 in income have experienced a loss of employment income, a majority of households with more than $50,000 in income, including those between $50,000 and $150,000, have not experienced any loss in earned income. I just gave you guys the data. I gave you the accurate data from the US Census, and the US Chamber of Commerce intentionally lied in their letter about the reality of people in this income bracket losing their employment. By the way, this is also driven by a ridiculous study that was done. We talked about this study by Opportunity Insights, and it's important to know who funds these types of think tanks. And so the Campaign to Limit Survival Check Eligibility was recently boosted by a study by economists at Opportunity Insights, a Harvard University think tank bankrolled by the family foundations of billionaires Mark Zuckerberg, Bloomberg, and Bill Gates. And then if you look at some of the funding for Senator Kaine in the 2020 cycle, oh, would you look at that? One of his top donors is actually Bloomberg with $72,975. This is from opensecrets.org. You should check it out for yourselves. So Cenk, if you're questioning whether this is intentional or stupid, I would argue it's certainly intentional and stupid, but not uninformed.
Right. So I think probably if Tim Kaine's watching this, which he most certainly isn't, he'll be very angry and say,
should be.
Oh, my 15th largest donor isn't going to affect me. And besides which, I'm superhuman. I'm not affected by any of my donors or the millions upon millions of dollars that they give me. Really? Then why are we playing this game? Because I'm going to ask you guys a simple question. Why does the Chamber of Commerce care about this issue? This is not about what money is going to businesses. That would be very and directly related to what they're doing. Instead, they're weighing in on how much individuals and families should get, and they're arguing that you should get less. Why do you think that they do that? They do that because they know something you don't know. it's a zero-sum game. And they're going to give out a certain amount of money, and the Chamber of Commerce is basically saying, we want more. And that means, by definition, the average American should get less. I want the money, and I want it for business, and almost only for business. So I'm gonna try to nickel and dime you guys. I'm gonna try to press you down, press you down, press you down. Now, we already affect these legislators by keeping your wages super low. We affect them by giving this gigantic tax cuts that Republicans give us, and then Democrats make permanent with slight tweaks as if they fought us. We orchestrate this entire kabuki theater, so our hands are in everything, including this, to make sure that your family gets less money because big business runs this town. If Tim Kaine or anyone else in Washington claims something to the contrary, they're being absurd. And every poll will show you that regular Americans don't believe them for a second. They think that all the millions of dollars that they get from business interests like the Chamber of Commerce definitively affects their votes. And this is yet another instance of it. So finally, think about the sleight of hand that they're doing here. And that's why I'm giving Chris a lot of credit here, because he's at least partly exposing it. So they say, oh, don't worry, we delivered on our promise of $2,000 checks. Now, the reality is though, but not for most of you. Because if nothing, like, think about it logically. If they said, all right, we're gonna get you $2,000 checks, and then after the election, they're like, we did it. We got $2,000 checks for everyone making under $10,000 a year. You'd be like, wait a minute, no, that wasn't the promise. That's a tiny amount of people. No, you said you'd get it to everyone who needed it, which 75,000 and under makes sense. That's what you had said before the election. $10,000 a year, that means you're not giving it to anybody. Well, the same is true of the new cap of 50,000. And by the way, again, it's not 50,000. At 50,000, you get nothing. And they start lowering it at 40,000. Okay, so if you cut out everybody from 50,000 to 75,000, even if we're being generous to them, you've cut out millions, tens of millions of Americans who thought they were gonna get a check, and now you're gonna get nothing. And now none of this had to happen because, again, they don't need a single Republican vote. But the Democrats use the Republicans as a foil to help the Chamber of Commerce achieve their objectives, which is to give you less money and give business more money.